to know what you need without overthinking. There is a very specific kind of moment that happens quietly and often without anyone else noticing, where something inside you begins to lose clarity, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that stops you completely, but in a subtle and persistent way that makes even simple decisions feel strangely difficult. You sit there and try to feel what you need, and instead of a clear sense of direction, there is a kind of internal noise that makes everything feel equally possible and equally wrong at the same time. You wonder whether you should continue or stop, whether you should rest or move forward, whether you should be alone or reach out to someone. And the more you try to listen for an answer, the less clear everything seems to become. What makes this especially confusing is that from the outside, nothing appears to be wrong. You are still functioning, still responding, still moving through your day, and yet internally there is a quiet disorientation, a feeling that your inner compass is no longer pointing clearly in any one direction. And because this lack of clarity feels uncomfortable, you begin to compensate by thinking more, analyzing more, trying to arrive at the right answer through effort, as if more mental activity could somehow produce a clearer signal. But what actually happens is the opposite. The more effort you apply, the more distant clarity seems to become, and this creates a very specific kind of inattention, because you begin to question your own ability to know what you need, when in reality, that ability has not disappeared at all. This is the part that is important to understand. You are not confused because you don't know what you need. You are confused because you are trying to listen from within too much internal noise. There is a difference between not having an answer and not being able to hear the answer that is already there. Your system is always communicating. There is always some form of signal present, some subtle indication of direction, preference, or need. But when too many signals are active at the same time, when thoughts, sensations, emotions, and external input begin to overlap, the system becomes indistinct, not silent, but crowded. And in a crowded internal space, clarity cannot organize itself. This is why trying to think your way into clarity rarely works in these moments, because clarity is not created through more thought. It is revealed through space. It requires a certain kind of inner quiet, not complete silence, but enough separation between signals so that one of them can become perceptible again. You can imagine it like being in a room where many people are speaking at the same time. None of the voices are unclear on their own, but because they overlap, you cannot distinguish any single one of them. The problem is not the voices. The problem is the lack of space between them. And this is often what happens inside a sensitive system. You are not lacking guidance. You are lacking the conditions that allow guidance to become clear. This is also where the conversation becomes deeper, because knowing what you need is not only a cognitive process, it is relational. It depends on your ability to stay in contact with your inner experience, to notice subtle shifts, to feel the difference between what expands you and what drains you, between what is aligned and what is not. And this relationship becomes more difficult to access when there is too much input, too much information, too many impressions, too many unfinished thoughts, too many small decisions layered on top of each other. When this happens, the connection to your own inner signals does not disappear, but it becomes more distant, more difficult to access, as if it is still there, but slightly out of reach. So the mind steps in and tries to compensate. It tries to organize, to categorize, to create clarity through reasoning, and this makes sense because thinking is fast, available, and structured. It gives the impression of movement, of progress, of doing something. But there is a quiet mismatch here, because the question, "What do I need?" does not belong to the mind alone. It belongs to a deeper layer, one that becomes quieter when there is too much activity, one that cannot be forced into clarity through analysis. And this is why overthinking becomes a loop. You are trying to solve a problem of internal noise with more internal activity, and that only increases the density of the space you are trying to listen within. So instead of asking the question more urgently, instead of trying to force a clear answer, something begins to shift when you approach it differently, more gently, more indirectly. You stop trying to extract clarity, and instead you begin to create the conditions in which clarity can appear. And this does not require a complex system. It does not require discipline or willpower. It only requires a small moment of orientation, a way to turn toward yourself without pressure, without urgency, without the expectation that you need to immediately know the right answer. And this is where a very simple structure becomes helpful. Not a rigid structure, not a system that you have to follow perfectly, but a small internal orientation that helps you reconnect with what is already there. There are 3 questions that can guide you back into contact with your own system. The first question is, am I overwhelmed or am I understimulated? This question is more subtle than it seems, because both states can feel very similar on the surface. Both can feel like restlessness, like discomfort, like a sense that something is off. But they come from completely different places. Overwhelm comes from too much input, too many impressions, too many things being processed at once. Understimulation comes from not enough engagement, not enough meaningful input, not enough that feels connected or relevant. And when you begin to sense which of these states you are actually in, something already starts to organize internally, because the system no longer feels ambiguous. The second question is, do I need less input or do I need different input? Sometimes what your system needs is reduction. Less noise, fewer conversations, fewer decisions, fewer open loops. And sometimes it is not reduction that is needed, but adjustment, a different kind of input, something that feels more coherent, more aligned, something that does not scatter your attention but gathers it. This distinction is important because without it, you might try to reduce when what you actually need is nourishment, or you might seek more stimulation when what you really need is less. The third question is, what is the smallest next step that creates a sense of orientation? Not the perfect step, not the complete solution, just one small movement that feels clear enough to follow. Because clarity does not return all at once. It returns gradually through movement, through engagement with something that is simple enough to hold. And when you take one small contained step, something begins to shift internally. The system starts to organize itself again. Not because everything is solved, but because there is now a direction. And direction creates calm, and something changes when you begin to move like this. You stop trying to force clarity. You stop expecting yourself to immediately know everything. You become less urgent, less harsh with yourself, because you begin to understand that the absence of clarity was never a failure. It was a signal that there was too much happening at the same time to hear clearly. And if this kind of experience feels familiar to you, if you recognize yourself in this subtle confusion, in this internal noise, in this effort to find clarity through thinking, then this space is for you, a space that is not about adding more input, but about creating more structure, more quiet, more depth. So if this is something you want more of, you can stay here, because you were never without guidance. You were never disconnected from what you need. There was simply too much happening at once to perceive it clearly. And when you begin to create a little more space, a little more internal structure, even in very small ways, the signal begins to return. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to take the next step, and then the next. And slowly, what once felt unclear begins to feel quietly self-evident again. And if this way of understanding yourself feels different, quieter, more accurate, then you may want to stay connected to this space, because everything here is built around one idea. That clarity doesn't come from more input, but from the right kind of structure.